Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome again to the Friday edition of Stir Crazy, episode 47. The streets are watching, and we are watching everything transpire from coast to coast in big cities and small ones as well, where people are taking to the streets in unprecedented numbers in places that you may not even think that people would care to even rally and protest in support of Black Lives Matter. But we are definitely in a very critical moment in United States history. And trust me, folks, what we are witnessing is indeed historic. I'm your host, Kim Brown. Folks, we have a really heavy show in store for you today. We're going to take a look at some of the instances of police brutality that citizen journalists and concerned folks are out there just capturing, that you may or may not see on your local news broadcast or even on the cable news broadcast for that matter. I bet you saw a whole lot of footage of cops kneeling and hugging and dancing with protesters, right? Nope, they canceled all that shit. That shit is over. It's a new time right now in policing in response to these protests about the murder of George Floyd. They are also getting support from the courts. There has been a tremendously bad court decision that has been handed down in New York State. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said it was the suspension of habeas corpus. The white power and white supremacy is consolidating right now, and they are doubling down and striking back against all of the massive amounts of folks that have taken to the streets to demand the end of police brutality, to call for police accountability, and so much more. So listen, of course, we love to hear from you in the chat, in the comments. We'll take your questions. We'll take your critiques, your observations. We want to hear everything, okay? But right now, it's time to bring in our fantastic Friday panel. We are honored to be joined today with Gerald Horne, author, historian, and professor at the University of Houston. Neill Franklin, also back with us today. Neill is the executive director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And our guy, Eze Jackson, recording artist and activist in Baltimore City. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
So the first thing we're going to do is I want you all to sit back and look at your screen, because we're going to show you some disturbing images coming from across the country. But it's important that we are aware that police are out here behaving in this way. So now let's go to LA, right? It was a kerfuffle. We saw the police chief there of the LAPD, Michael Moore, have to apologize for saying that some of the protesters were as responsible for George Floyd's death as the actual cops who are now charged in his murder. Weird, but he did apologize. Let's take a look at some of that footage. And that was shot yesterday, that video courtesy of ABC 7 Eyewitness News out in LA. And now let's take you to Chicago, where Fox 23 captured this scene between Chicago police and protesters. Let's have a look at that. Now, this next video that we're going to see was shot a couple of nights ago. This was in Denver, and this one has gone viral on social media, where what you're going to see is a man in a car. He's going to get out of his car. He's going to start yelling at police because apparently this person was not involved in any of the protests. They were stuck in traffic as a result of road closures. And witness how Denver police respond to him, and especially when he tells them that he has a vulnerable person in his vehicle. Let's have a look. What are you gonna do? Steal my car? What are you gonna steal my car? Get the fucking pepper ball, my girlfriend
Are you? Shoot it! Fuck you! You shot a car with a pregnant woman in it! With fucking tear gas! Fuck you! I ain't going nowhere! Fucking bitches! Fuck, shoot it again! She's fucking pregnant! Shoot it again! Are you? There's a pregnant woman in the car!
As you heard the gentleman scream at the police that there's a pregnant woman in the car, and you saw the police just unload with those pepper balls. And lastly, this is an incident, again, making the rounds on social media. People have been very appalled by this scene coming out of Buffalo, where the Buffalo Police Department start to advance on people out in the streets, and they knock over an elderly protester. It's a little graphic. Let's take a peek.
He is
bleeding out of his ear. He's bleeding out of his ear. Get somebody over here. He's bleeding out of his ear. Get him medic.
What the fuck you walking up on me? I'm gonna grab. Get the fuck away. Call the cops. Y'all don't want this shit.
Back up. Get off the steps. Let's go. Get back. Get back.
Get an ambulance for him. He's there. We have EMT on scene.
So that video was courtesy of WBFO FM, Buffalo's public radio station there. Shout out to the public media, definitely getting the footage that people absolutely need to see. Now, the status of that person who was knocked down, according to local media reports, indicate that he was a 75-year-old man. He was taken to Erie County Medical Center, and he is in serious but stable condition, and that he is reported to be alert. The Erie County District Attorney has already made a statement about this incident, that the Buffalo Police Department, their police chief, initially said that the gentleman tripped and fell. As we can see from the video, that was not the case. He was clearly pushed. The new news is that the members of that task force have resigned, not from the force, but from that particular unit assignment, in protest behind those two officers. Two of those officers in that scene have been suspended. Let's take a look at the Erie County District Attorney's Office. They set out a tweet. They said, quote, "The Erie County DA's office continues to investigate the incident captured on video outside of City Hall that resulted in the injury of a protester. The victim was taken to Erie County Medical Center to be treated for a head injury. He was unable to provide a statement to investigators last night." Well, if you take a look at the video, that could probably aid a lot in your investigation. Panel, we are seeing some stunning pictures come from around the country. I'm sure y'all have seen stuff that, in addition to what we featured on here tonight. And Neill, of course, I got to come to you first, being, former law enforcement and working actively to reform policing and how it's done right now in its current form. What are your observations about what you have seen in cities and in towns across America?
Well, I'm mad as hell. Just in the few clips that you just have shown, I was familiar with the last one, and this is assault. This is assault. Every one of those videos that you just showed is assault. Firing the police officers is not enough. They all need to be criminally charged, those who were involved. And we have to start holding the supervisors, the managers who were on the scene of each one of those. They need to be held accountable as well. And that's what we're not doing. I'm pissed, Kim. I'm really pissed behind this, because we all know why we're here, from police violence. We've seen it time after time after time after time again. And now we've seen it with Mr. George Floyd. We've had protests break out all across this country in just about every city and town and county. And these cops still don't get it. The only way they're going to get it is when we start putting people in jail who are wearing the uniforms and taking money out of their pockets. I can't see it happening any other way.
Professor Horne, you know, people are being brutalized for taking to the streets to protest police brutality. It seems like a pretty vicious cycle in a circle that we're looking at happen right here in real time. Can you give us some historical context on this? Because obviously this is eerily reminiscent of what happened in cities in the entire South during the civil rights movement. But we are in 2020. It is a different time, but many of the tactics remain the same.
Well, first of all, it begins with the horrendous treatment of enslaved Africans going back to the origins of settler colonialism centuries ago. And then it accelerates with the revolt against British rule in 1776, led by slaveholders who thought London was moving towards the abolition of slavery. The Africans, by several orders of magnitude, did not support the settlers. And when you fight a war and lose, as we did, you can expect to be pulverized and penalized forevermore. And from that seed, you can draw a straight line to what happened to Mr. Floyd, because historically, Black people in particular have been treated as if we're on the verge of rebellion, individually or collectively. We're viewed oftentimes as criminals in waiting. And indeed, the origins of modern urban police departments start with slave patrols shortly after the founding of the United States in the 18th century. And what was interesting about the slave patrols is that it, in a sense, deputized every national on North American soil who was defined as white, who could then get rewards for returning escaped Africans to their so-called masters. And that helps to bake into the culture, bake into the system, a general antipathy towards Black people, which extends to this very day. Now, the way we've been able to break that chain of iniquity is by forging global alliances, which is one of the reasons why I'm so pleased and gratified by the protests in Berlin, Germany, London, England, Sydney, Australia, Auckland, New Zealand, the fact that a high-level representative of the African Union invited a delegate from the United States into their headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and read him the Riot Act with regard to what's going on in these streets. And I must say, even with regard to myself, I've been interviewed repeatedly by global media of late, including Russia, Turkey, and particularly Iran. And in fact, I've been suggesting to the Iranian friends that they should bring the United States before the United Nations Human Rights Commission with a charge against human rights violations against Black people. And secondly, they should organize a committee in support of Black people in the United States that then should have branches in Syria, in Lebanon, and in virtually every Muslim country. And let's hope that that suggestion is executed.
Absolutely. Eze Jackson, I know you have been out in the streets. You've been in this fight for a while in Baltimore City. Share with us some of your observations of how the protest movement has taken shape in Baltimore over the past 7 to 10 days and what the police response has been to people out in the streets.
I think for Baltimore, we are in a unique position in that, over the past 5 years, post Freddie Gray, there has been a lot of work done between the community and police, right? So the protests here have been mostly peaceful. The police have, even in a lot of circumstances, allowed the people to, quote unquote, police the protest. And even at one point we had a lieutenant here who stood in front of a crowd and said their names, you know what I mean? And, some people argue that, maybe that was an act or whatever. There's still a lot of issues going on here in Baltimore with the police. I don't want people to think that, we've solved everything here. We haven't. But I think the protests that have happened here are indicative of the work that is being done between police and community, because we've been kept it fairly peaceful. It's not been a lot of issues. when I look at these videos, though, the triggering part for me is around the country, you know, the Blue Lives Matter folks and people who want to defend the police always say, you know, they're not all bad cops. There's good cops out there. And, you know, right now I would challenge people to get those good cops to speak the fuck up. Because right now, where we are in this country, we need 100,000 Neill Franklins. You know, we need 100,000 Neill Franklins. And, you know, we need people to speak up. When people say, you know, they know good cops or they know people that are in law enforcement. No, you don't. You know that person when they come home. You don't know how they are when they're out in the field, how they're acting. And these guys are acting all total asses. You know, they want to play with their toys. They want to shoot off their weapons. They want to swing their batons and do all this stuff. And then they come home and they throw cookouts and, you know, stuff like that in the neighborhood. And you go, oh, well, he's a good guy. He's a good cop. You don't know that. This is the same guy that's not just doing this stuff, but he's backing up the guy that's doing it.
100% easy. And you mentioned, you know, how police are behaving out in the streets. There is one more video that I wanted to show. This one coming out of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is nuts right now. The cops are behaving badly. They've had alleged incidents of white supremacists, white nationalists. There was video circulating around of this biker gang in the mix with the protesters fighting, street fighting them, fist fighting them. It is 100% stunning, but not more stunning than the actions of how this particular police officer in Philadelphia behaved in advance of the curfew. The curfew had not even begun yet, but the cops here were trying to disperse the crowd, and they did so violently. Let's take a look.
Oh my God.
I mean, absolutely staggering photos there, but and pictures and video. However, due to some due diligence through people in the Twitter sphere and journalists, they have discovered the name of this officer. Let's take a look at that tweet there, Dwayne, because this cop is apparently a high-ranking Philadelphia Police Department commander, the one in the white shirt. His name is... Well, first of all, this incident happened in Philly on the Ben Franklin Parkway, you go down by the art museums. This was on Monday evening. And this officer, his name is Joseph Baloney. Okay. Now, Joey Baloney, I wish I was making his name up. That's probably why he's so angry. WHYY did some further investigations and discovered that this cop has been linked to a number of investigations regarding either involving narcotics and misconduct. I'm going to quote from the article. In 2014, Baloney was cited for failure to supervise 4 narcotics officers who were accused of lying and theft, chronicled in the Pulitzer Prize-winning Daily News series Tainted Justice. He was subsequently reassigned to lead the 19th district in West Philadelphia. Baloney oversaw a tactical squad that would go on to garner a high volume of misconduct complaints. Neill Franklin, I'm gonna toss this one to you again. Just,
you know,
I mean,
it sounds like the gun trace task force, right?
Come on, bro.
you got road cops who are not properly managed, not properly supervised, no oversight, allowed to go out there and do what the hell they want to do. You know, when I saw him assault these folks at the protest, what you just showed on the video, and I saw that white shirt, before you said it, I said, that's a damn commander. That's supposed to be leadership. And this is one of the things I've been speaking to. I spoke to earlier. Until we start holding leadership accountable. This, you know, when you have a sergeant or lieutenant, he's got to be a lieutenant or a captain or higher. You know, when you have him acting this way, he's virtually saying to all those other officers, This is how you do it. This is how you do it. And how can management hold officers accountable when management's doing the same thing? You know,
I mean, go ahead, by all means.
no. So you mentioned his history. This is why we need to have these personnel folders, these internal affairs files of police officers opened up. And I don't mean so that we see their phone numbers and all this personal history about their family. I want to know about excessive force. I want to know about corruption. I want to know about lying on official documents and in court. I want to know about citizens' complaints. All of that should be available to the public to examine so that we know when we have a rogue officer or a problematic officer in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and then we can take action, not to get them moved to another district to become somebody else's problem, but to get them fired. If they demonstrated they don't know how to police and do their job the right way, we got to move them out. We need community oversight, real community oversight of our police departments, where we're controlling the budget, we're hiring and firing the police chief, we're setting the philosophy for what's important to us and how we want you to police within our neighborhoods.
Professor Horne, we have witnessed police brutality over a number of generations now, but it is in our recent history where the response to brutality has been, well, we're going to train the police better. We're going to allocate more funds to police for their training. And they seem to be well trained, but not in de-escalation or trying to, quell a situation non-violently. What does history tell us about trying to retrain cops who behave this way, even if it is systemic?
Well, I endorse and co-sign all of the admirable proposals that you've just heard. And I dare say that when the Congressional Black Caucus introduces this package of police reform proposals, they will be similarly admirable. Some measures had been in motion, but apparently have been suspended, such as the Pentagon dispensing surplus materiel used to fight wars to urban police departments, grenade launchers and all the armored personnel carriers and all the rest. Certainly when you send such military materiel to the police, just like to a hammer, everything resembles a nail. When you send people warfighting machinery, they tend to see civilians as combatants in the battle space, as Pentagon Chief Mark Esper put it so inelegantly a few days ago. But it's striking that we're focusing on Philadelphia because this raises an even more troublesome issue, which helps us to understand why reform has been so difficult. You might recall that just a day or two ago, Philadelphia removed the statue of former police chief and former mayor Frank Rizzo, who of all of the notorious police thugs that have served in cities, deserves a place as perhaps number one in that regard. And yet, the fact that he was known as a brutalizer probably helped to ensure that he got elected as mayor. And so what we're talking about is not just a problem of bad apples, as Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor to the 45th US president, put it. We're talking about a mass base, a mass electoral base for this kind of brutalizing. And that is a more intractable problem. I mean, for example, I've heard quite a bit of late of trying to convert police departments from being occupation armies to being the equivalent of social workers, and for them not to carry guns. But then that runs into this Second Amendment litigation and judicial opinions, which tends to frown upon the idea of denuding anybody of a gun, for example. We've talked as well about other sorts of measures to engage in police reform, but then you have this campaign finance system that favors the 1%, which oftentimes tends to opt for the Frank Rizzos to head police departments. So this is a very steep mountain we have to climb, and therefore I trust and I hope that we're ready for this ascent.
Y'all, we have a lot of comments in the comments. People are weighing in. The Salt Laker says it's gone to absurd levels. Another viewer who said during the video, Hockey said, I can't watch this. What the fuck? We also have another comment from Chevy Mustang. You can reform policing, but how do you reform criminal behavior? And Easy, again, you have firsthand experience, seeing how Baltimore policing have come under federal consent decree from the Department of Justice, and yet for the people who read that consent decree, it was appalling. Like, the cops had investigators riding with them, and they were still continuing to violate openly people's civil rights and more. Neill mentioned the Gun Trace Task Force. If you're outside of Maryland, please Google the Gun Trace Task Force, because it is eye-opening. The type of chicanery and just blatant criminal activities that this group of cops were committing against the public, in addition to dealing drugs and setting people up for crime, to be arrested for crimes. Easy, give me your perspective on what Professor Horne had to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to start exposing this stuff and find a way to expose this stuff all over the country. In Baltimore, the Gun Trace Task Force wasn't a surprise to those of us who have grown up here, who know what it is to work with, to be a police, to be in neighborhoods that are heavily policed. I tell the story often about when I was younger. There was a police officer in my neighborhood that we nicknamed him RoboCop. He was a big ass white boy, and he was known to, if he showed up to an event, he was gonna fuck somebody up. That was what was known about him. I saw him run a young man's face into a brick wall one time, and the blood splashing off of his face is something I think about all the time, even as an adult. And these images are things that we constantly see, but a lot of people in a lot of cities and a lot of places just don't have the power to expose this stuff. And I think what we're seeing now is an increase in these things being exposed that have existed for decades, in our cities, especially cities like Chicago, and Baltimore and Buffalo and LA. There's probably a whole category of LA police movies. So we've seen all of these and heard all these stories about the LAPD, but for some reason there's still this power there. And I think one of the things that Neill Franklin brought up earlier was really good, is like, investigate these people with backgrounds, because they're the police chiefs, they're the FOP leaders, they're the union leaders, they're the police chiefs, they're the commissioners, they're the lieutenants. These guys already have a history under their belt, and it's almost like the promotion is the reward.
So I want us to go to a story out of Michigan, because, when we talk about investigating these police, their backgrounds, their attitudes towards, Black people, brown people, indigenous people, et cetera, whether or not they are domestic abusers, which we know a pretty significant amount of police are accused or convicted of domestic violence. But let's look at this piece, Dwayne, from MLive, okay? The Shelby Township Police Chief, his name is Robert Shield, placed on administrative leave this week. Now, why was he placed on administrative leave? Because he put up some tweets, okay, that, and I'm going to read. Now, first of all, he has since deleted these tweets and deleted his entire Twitter account, which is, part of the standard operating procedure when these things get unearthed. But let me just read to you what MLive.com reported, that the Shelby Township Police Chief tweeted, quote, "Trump threatening to deploy the military? I have a better idea. Unleash the real cops and let them take care of these barbarians. I promise it will be over in 24 hours. Another tweet read, quote, "Wild savages." He's referring to looters in New York City. Quote, I wish to God I would have been there. Body bags for these vicious subhumans. Oh, and on another note, I dare you to try to drag me out of my vehicle. The police chief of Shelby Township, that is outside of Detroit. Another way that the cops are getting help, I would say, is certainly from the criminal justice system. And I wanted to refer to this really shocking decision that came out of the New York State Supreme Court. This has been reported by commondreams.org and a number of other outlets. But on Thursday, New York Supreme Court Justice James Burke rejected a petition seeking the immediate release of hundreds of protesters who had been held by the NYPD for more than 24 hours. The judge ruled that the extraordinary circumstances justify indefinite detention. I want y'all to hear what I just said. In New York State, a judge has just authorized the NYPD to hold protesters and people who have been arrested for protesting indefinitely. Okay. That is terrifying. Lawmakers across New York State and activists have condemned this ruling. But the judge went on to say in his decision, quote, it is a crisis within a crisis. All writs were denied. Panel, we have seen the suspension of constitutional rights happen since these protests have exploded across the country in a variety of ways. People's right to assemble has been denied when the curfews were put into place. We've seen blatant attacks by police on members of the press, targeting members of the press for violence. And now this decision coming out of New York State saying that the NYPD specifically can hold people indefinitely, way longer than the 24 hours that they are supposed to be held. Gerald, I'll let you to field this first. What is your reaction about this decision that has been handed down by the New York State Supreme Court?
Well, I certainly like to read the judicial opinion because I find it very hard to believe, even given these draconian circumstances we're facing now, that we proceeded so far down the road to a unique brand of neo-fascism. But in light of the fact that Senator Ron Wyden has termed Mr. Trump's photo op on Monday, where he used the leader of the military in battle fatigues and his comrades to clear away peaceful protesters in front of a church across the street from the White House, which brought a denunciation from the former Pentagon chief, Jim Mattis. In light of what we've been seeing in terms of these clips, perhaps I've underestimated how far down we now are towards the road to a kind of neo-fascism. Certainly all of this loose talk about martial law is not very helpful, because martial law basically presupposes precisely the suspension of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus forces the jailers to release the prisoners once the writ with the court is filed. Of course, martial law basically entails the suspension of the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Martial law would make the kind of no-knock raid that led to the slaying of Breonna Taylor, who would have been 27 years old today, in Louisville. Of course, she was killed as a result of no-knock raids. Martial law would make that much more prevalent. So obviously, it seems to me the situation is more dire than some of us might have imagined. And I think that there's a lot of blame to go around, but I would point the finger of accusation at some point towards those who tried to convince us that despite the fact when the Constitution was enunciated, it did not apply to the indigenous nor the Africans. And yet, even today, this is being saluted as a grand democratic experiment. You might as well salute apartheid South Africa as a grand democratic experiment, since after all, those of European descent had a full panoply of rights. Let's not talk about the African majority, for example. So I'm afraid to say that chickens may be coming home to roost, and there might be an opportunity for some of us to escape, I hope.
Escape sounds amazing right now, Professor. Eze Jackson, we have seen the courts really collude with police together, in this white power institution, to have each other's back, to make sure that the police are afforded the legal latitude to violate people's rights, by having judges that are sympathetic to the police and their behaviors. What is your response to this court ruling coming out of New York State?
I mean, I think that in general, we have to remember that white supremacy was very carefully constructed, very intelligently maneuvered and established. And in order for us to break it down, we are going to have to do a lot of work, and be strategic and tenacious, and intelligent. Right? These structures are in a place because you have this kind of support. We also know that the criminal justice system is very much funded by poor people. It lives and thrives on the backs of poor people, of oppression, and violating people's rights on the regular. So I'm not surprised by this judge coming out and saying that. It's just indicative of the white supremacist structure that we have in this country. And that white supremacist structure relies heavily on law enforcement.
Neill, I'd like to get your take on the decision in New York State, but also we have a question from the comments. Logan Feeney says, there needs to be a list of bad cops that are banned from police work of any kind. No security guard work, no prison guard work at a federal level. Does this exist? And I know the Baltimoreans on the panel are well aware of the do not call list, and perhaps you can inform our audience about that. But Neill, I'd like to get your take.
Yeah, so I'll quickly answer the one for the judge. Obviously, this needs to be challenged. This ruling needs to be challenged. But more importantly, this judge and others who make similar type rulings, if these judges are appointed or elected, we need to ensure that they are removed as soon as possible. We need to track such rulings, the same way we track data on prosecutors, the same way we track data on other elected officials. We need to do the same thing with judges. We're seeing that now. So whatever it takes to get them removed, that's what we need to do. Regarding tracking officers, one of the things that we are advocating for, and the viewers, I would suggest that you go to our website, which is lawenforcementaction.org, and look at the list of demands that we have. And we already have close to 100 law enforcement leaders from around the country who have signed on to it. This is one of them, that we have a national database tracking officers, number one, that have been terminated from a job anywhere in the United States as a police officer. And then if they've been terminated for things like excessive force, corruption, lying on official documents, and so on, then they need to be prohibited from being certified as a police officer anywhere else in the country. So we definitely need that sort of system at the state level, every state across the country, and then that information needs to go into a national database. But we need to go a step further, because many of these police officers resign before they are terminated. And when that happens, the police department, they cease the investigation for whatever it may be. There needs to be policy passed that the investigation needs to continue and needs to be terminated, it needs to be ruled upon. And if it is sustained, then the same rule applies, that officer, his information goes into the database and they cannot be rehired anywhere else in the country as a certified police officer.
Folks, one of the more disturbing things, I mean, there is a lot of disturbing things that we have seen come out across America in the past several days. But Washington, D.C. has been a flashpoint, in addition to Minneapolis and New York and L.A. and Chicago and Denver and all these other places. But D.C. was unique in the sense that Donald Trump ordered armed members of the military to come and patrol city streets, to act as a crowd control enforcement group. Now, this was after DC Mayor Muriel Bowser called in the DC National Guard. But what happened was National Guards from across the country started to converge on Washington, D.C., not ordered by the mayor. And this has been reported on quite a bit. There's a really good piece on Vice right now about this, who these officers are, from what jurisdictions do they come from what agencies do they work. Let's go to the Dallas Morning News did a report on this, because one of their reporters noticed that some of the officers that have been deployed to the streets of Washington, D.C., were wearing Texas patches and insignias on their uniforms that denoted that they worked for the Bureau of Federal Prisons in Texas. And in addition to them, because again, these folks are not identified in any way. They're not wearing badges. They're not wearing something, a name patch with either their name or badge number or any identifying markers. And when asked and approached by journalists and others, they refuse to identify themselves. So we really don't know who these armed individuals are, and if they are in fact committing assault against protesters, violating people's civil rights. Who do you hold accountable? Like, who do you go tell about that exactly? So Muriel Bowser, again, the mayor of DC, has raised this concern. She's doing some performative neoliberal things, as some of these Democrats tend to do. But the one thing that she is definitely sure about is that she wants these other non-DC National Guardsmen out of her city. And one of the states that have sent the National Guard is Utah. And the senator from Utah, Senator Mike Lee, is seemingly okay with members of his state's National Guard just chilling in DC. So he sent these tweets out yesterday. He said, "Just heard that Mayor Bowser is kicking the Utah National Guard out of our DC hotels tomorrow. More than 1,200 troops from 10 states are being evicted. This is unacceptable." He went on to say, "These brave men and women have risked their lives protecting DC for 3 days. Rioting, looting, arson, and vandalism have all disappeared because these soldiers served, and now they're being kicked to the curb by an ungrateful mayor. This must be stopped." Professor Horne, many have pointed to the fact that this could be a violation, these National Guardsmen remaining in D.C., not under the request of D.C.'s mayor, could be in violation of the Third Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits, soldiers from being quartered without the consent of the people who live in a given jurisdiction. Can you shed some light on this? When has this happened before, and has it happened before? I assume it has, though.
Well, the only time I recall this happening is during the pre-1776 period, when that was one of the complaints put forward by the settlers against London, which led to that particular constitutional amendment. I'm not aware, I have to confess, of any litigation since that particular time. But in any case, we have other issues too to ventilate. For example, in all these photos that you've shown, I haven't seen any officers with masks on, despite the fact that supposedly that's part of the best practice of curbing the pandemic. And I see a lot of officers shouting, and presumably there are droplets being emitted from their mouths, being aerosolized. Perhaps they're asymptomatic and don't realize they have the coronavirus. So bringing all these strange men into Washington from the four corners of the country may be the equivalent of a kind of a super spreading event. And I trust and I hope that the authorities are keeping that in mind. I think that also what you see in Washington should be looked at with grave concern by Washington's neighbors, not least the state of Maryland, because the 45th U.S. president, the oath in the Oval Office, does have more latitude, although it's not unilateral, in terms of the federal district, say the territory around Capitol Hill or the White House, etc. And in any case, Washington, D.C. happens to be the most heavily surveilled and policed sites on planet Earth. Not only the Metropolitan Police Department, the FBI, and the Park Police, the Capitol Hill Police, ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, DEA. I mean, it's an alphabet soup of people who are authorized to carry guns, who are under at least the nominal supervision of the US president. And this obviously presents a very combustible situation. And then, months before this current conflict erupted in the streets of Washington, I noticed a photo that you should be able to find of anti-aircraft weapons to protect the White House. This may be reference concerning that tweet, that dangerous tweet of Mr. Trump a few days ago about so-called, quote, ominous weapons, unquote, in addition to, quote, vicious dogs, unquote, that would be unleashed against protesters. So it could easily spill over, this kind of combustibility, across the district line into Maryland, perhaps even into Baltimore itself. So it's well that we're focusing on this issue, because you may be engaged in, whether you know it or not, in a kind of enlightened self-interest.
Well, thank you, Professor. I live in Prince George's County, so now I am more terrified than I was before you shared that nugget of information with us. Yeah, I see jets flying over my neighborhood all the time. I'm a mile outside of DC on the northeast side. I don't live in the flight path of Reagan National Airport. So again, I know the difference between commercial planes and jets and other crazy stuff. Like, y'all wouldn't even imagine the kind of aircraft that fly and patrol the airspace in the DMV. Eze Jackson, I wanted to get your take on, because again, the same thing happened in Baltimore in 2015. Cops just showing up out of nowhere, right? Like, not identifying themselves, coming from all across the state, coming from other states. That has got to be a terrifying notion, to know that really these could be mercenaries. These could be Blackwater. It could be anybody dressed like a cop out there who has the right gun, right?
Yeah, I think we have to remember that these guys, these people in these law enforcement agencies, departments, even in prison corrections, the mentality is that they are out for blood. They're bloodthirsty. They have the job because they want to have a reason to fuck somebody up. So they will spend their money, their resources to come to another city and make it seem like they're protecting DC from protesters and looters. But in all actuality, they're having fun. You know what I mean? They're coming out and they're trying to get some stripes under their belt. They want this. They want blood. They took the job initially so that they could do these things. And I think this is just indicative of that. That's the mentality of these guys. They're not in this to actually protect people or actually bring peace. They get their rocks off fucking people up. This is what they want to do.
And they've been given that carte blanche, it would seem, as Professor Horne referred to him as the oaf in the Oval Office, President Donald Trump. Somehow he's somewhere trying to put together a sentence, right? We know that Trump is not known for, being particularly eloquent or appropriate most of the time. And he said something truly inappropriate recently regarding George Floyd. Let's take a look at that.
Hopefully George is looking down right now and saying there's a great thing that's happening for our country. There's a great day for him. It's a great day for everybody. This is a great day for everybody. This is a great, great day.
Yeah, just the levels of delusion and disconnect and, obfuscation of the truth. And, Donald Trump is clearly the worst person to be leading us in this moment right now, Professor Horne.
I'm sorry, but I just feel like when we constantly talk about Donald Trump, we have to remember that this is the guy from The Apprentice. Like, the guy from The Apprentice is our president. And I don't know what more people are expecting from him. Like, at this point, I can't even get angry at what he's saying or what he says or what he does. It's like, this is the guy. Like, this is the guy that we have running our country. And of course he's disconnected. This man has never struggled a day in his life. He does not spend any time in the Black community or around anybody who is actually, like, experiencing the things that most Americans are going through. He has no empathy. He has no empathy, no understanding of what it is to be poor, to be a person of color. And all he knows is what it's like to be a rich white man.
Well, what Trump does well, in my opinion, is that he is masterful at distraction, and he is masterful at attempting to rewrite history in his favor in real time, right? As if he has not been fact checked since he declared his candidacy for president, right? They have caught him lying over thousands of times by now, and it doesn't change how he presents the narrative. And Professor Horne, I mean, these are strongman tactics. This is a totalitarian kind of operating method of operations that Donald Trump has engaged. And people complained and said that George Bush acted like a dictator by expanding the powers of the executive office, which was true. And then his the person who succeeded him, Barack Obama, took that ball and ran with that as well. But why is what Donald Trump is doing so unprecedented?
Well, first of all, there's the level of incompetence. Second of all, I do think it's important to say that there has been a sharp turn to the right. And I think that that's what the 63 million people who voted for Mr. Trump have demanded. That is to say that they would like to see the clock turned back. Keep in mind that the changes that have taken place in this country over the past 60 or 70 years were not universally embraced. There were riots in the Euro-American community across class lines in 1957 when the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas were desegregated. A similar process took place in Boston in the 1970s, which suggests that this was not a sectional dispute, a dispute between the North and the South. And Mr. Trump is the kind of leader, in some ways not unlike Ronald Wilson Reagan, who also sought to turn back the clock, not unsuccessfully, who is very pliable, who will basically just drive hard to the right, as represented by his signature issue, which is packing the federal courts. As we speak, more judges for life are being appointed to the federal courts, and they will be serving on these courts long after Mr. Trump is gone. And this is one of the reasons why, once again, we're at a very dangerous moment. And quite frankly, anyone who is able to leave the United States right now probably should contemplate it. And this is not unprecedented. Recall that your own Frederick Douglass of Maryland, after the failed John Brown's raid of 1859, he split. He got out of Dodge, basically, but he came back. And there's no sin about leaving the United States. It's not just a matter of self-preservation. It allows you to mobilize forces abroad, who oftentimes are more favorable to our cause in any case.
Man, that sounds like a plan, Professor. Problem is, the COVID is running so rampant through the United States. Americans are not welcome a lot of places right now. You can't even go places, even if you wanted to. So, yeah, I hope my mom heard what you just suggested, because I've been telling her that for the past few years. Like, we need to get the hell up out of here, because this is about to be bad. Eze, I want to give you a chance to respond to what Professor Horne had to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that might, really change some things, is if there's a strong exodus from America. I mean, they've made it very clear that many of us are not welcome. We're not wanted. But there's also a sense of a hope in me that all of this stuff being exposed does, cause some kind of change. It's simple, but I remember when I was younger and I used to wear my pants hanging off my ass, and it wasn't until one day my mother sat there and made fun of somebody she saw on TV, a rapper, like with his pants hanging down, and was like, "That's what you look like. You see that? That's you. That's what you look like." And I think right now, rich white America, the U.S. is being shown themselves. Look at you. This is what you look like. We look like we are embarrassing on the world stage right now. And you know, there's a part of me that agrees, yeah, move. I would like to move. I would like to be able to just up and bounce. But then there's a part of me that kind of wants to hang in there and see how this plays out, because I just don't imagine that we can continue this way.
Speaking of not continuing this way, I wanted to pop up real quick a tweet from Baltimore City Councilman Ryan Dorsey. And what Councilman Dorsey does here is he illustrates the amount of funding that Baltimore City Police receive in comparison to other city agencies like housing and community development, employment development, homeless services, recreation and parks, art and culture, the health department, Office of Civil Rights, and police. Now, if you are looking at your screen right now, you are seeing that Baltimore City Police, easy, is this right? $509 million annually?
Yeah.
That's a disgusting number relative to $41 million spent for health, $39 million spent for housing. Where's education? I don't even see education up here. Right. But it's not going to be $500 million. I can guarantee you that. $509 million is what the Baltimore City Police get out of the city budget every single year. So now let's go to the tweet from the Minneapolis City Council president. Lisa Bender says that, yes, we are going to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department and replace it with a transformative new model of public safety. This is really, really amazing coming from elected officials. Whether or not it can actually bear out to be made into successful policy, of course, time will tell that tale. Professor Horne, your thoughts about, number one, the amount of money that police receive annually. I mean, Baltimore is not an anomaly here. That is probably the case with every major city in the United States, likely in every state as well. But when you continue to fund police at this level, to the defunding of things that benefit the community, we have reached a crisis moment where things are breaking down, and the reality of the disproportionate amount of money that we invest in police relative to everything else in our community is breaking open for all to see right now.
Well, it reminds me of an old saying when I used to be a chess player. And the saying was this: to be good in chess, you have to be bad in everything else, because you have to focus so much attention on that particular game. And that's to the detriment of your other activities. And so likewise, if you're spending so much on the police and you see their role as being dominant, well, then obviously spending on health and education and economic development are going to suffer. But fortunately, in light of the George Floyd slaying, this is becoming part of a national movement. I noticed that Mayor Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles just said that they're slashing $150 million from the police department and going to take those funds and apply it to the Black community. Now, of course, there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip. We're going to have to keep a careful eye on what seems to be a positive proposal. But certainly, I think that opens the door for other cities to emulate both Baltimore and Los Angeles. And before we have to sign off, I think you wanted me to respond to the 1619 project.
That's right. There's a question in the comments that says, can you ask Professor Horne about the 1619 project? What do you think about it? The question says, some communists have criticized it, and this commenter wants to know what you thought about the 1619 project.
Well, how much time do I have?
As much time as you need, Professor.
Well, first of all, I might not be the best person to answer this, because actually the 1619 project, which was published in the New York Times Magazine under the leadership of the Black journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones in August 2019, in many ways adapted some of the ideas that I put forward in my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, which suggested, as I did a moment ago, that the revolt against British rule that led to the formation of the United States was based on freedom, the freedom to enslave other people, particularly our ancestors. And that helps to shed light and explain why we're still being treated so horribly and atrociously, still being treated like slaves. But I should also say on the other side of the ledger that the right wing, and by the way, it's not just folks on the left, the right wing has been very active in attacking me, Nicole Hannah-Jones, etc. And even though they don't deserve this publicity, they just put out a film, believe it or not, where they attacked the New York Times and imputed my ideas in favor of the Cuban Revolution and land reform in Zimbabwe, for example. They imputed those ideas to the New York Times in a kind of McCarthyism, and then suggested that I was the evil genius behind the 1619 Project, which is, of course, poppycock and balderdash and nonsense, but it's representative, once again, of the uphill climb that we have to endure.
Eze Jackson, I'm going to let you get the last word in here before we wrap things up. What is your take about what Ryan Dorsey put out in regards to those discrepancies between Baltimore City funding the cops versus everything else in Baltimore City?
I think that when I said earlier, this is the kind of stuff that gives me a little bit of hope. And when I see the council president in Minnesota and Councilman Ryan Dorsey putting this stuff out there for the people, Ryan Dorsey ran in a district that before he was the council person before him, his policy was wherever the mayor goes, that's the way I'm going, right? So when Ryan Dorsey went to run in that district and was, talking to folks in that district, these are the kind of things that they wanted him to do, to expose what's going on behind the curtain. Before him, that wasn't happening. You know what I mean? And this is happening all over the city of Baltimore, right? Where we have more progressive leaders in positions like city council exposing what's going on behind the curtain. For so long, so many of us don't know what's happening behind the curtain. So when I talk to people who, who question the process of voting, it's examples like this that I show them, like, if you're involved in this process, you can change things at the very least locally, on your local level. We never had a council person exposing exactly where the budget was going. Yes, the information about the hearing was available somewhere where that if you were in the know, you could look it up and find out that the city council was having a budget hearing, but you didn't have council people putting it out there to the people. Look, this is where your money is going, y'all. Pay attention to this shit. And Ryan Dorsey, and I'm sure the city council president in Minnesota, is doing exactly what the people elected them to do and asked them to do. And that part gives me a little bit of hope.
All right, gang, we're going to have to leave it there. We've been speaking with rapper, rocker, activist Eze Jackson. Of course, we've been joined with author, professor, and historian Gerald Horne. Neill Franklin was on the line with us. Neill had to scoot out a little bit early. Obviously, you can imagine how much of demand Neill is in right now, but we definitely want to thank Neill Franklin for taking the time to join us. And thank you all for your wonderful questions and your comments. We appreciate it. We just really dig the conversation that is being had in our chats and in the comment section. And of course, we always like to hear from you. You can email us, stircrazy@therealnews.com. I'm your host, Kim Brown. Listen, if you're going to be out in the streets this weekend, please be safe. Keep your camera phones on and rolling. Please keep an eye on these police because they are out here doing illegal things to protesters. They should not be allowed to do that without accountability. And unfortunately, the cell phone is the only thing that might hold them accountable. So keep your phones on, keep your mask on. COVID-19 is still out there. Be safe. Have a great weekend. We'll see you on Monday.